Hi everybody, and welcome to part 2 of this series of videos on Act 3 Scene 4 of Othello. If you haven't watched my video on part 1 of this scene, then I'd suggest that you do that now before you watch this one, because we're going to be picking this up at about line 30 of this particular scene. I'm not going to dwell too much on the plot here, but the important thing to note is that the handkerchief is going to become absolutely critical to the action of the scene. So the big question we're going to be asking ourselves today is, how does Shakespeare present the impact of jealousy? And we're thinking about how the individual is presented here and the impact that the change in the individual can have on the whole of society. So Iago uses information about the handkerchief and it's the loss of the handkerchief to poison Othello's mind, and therefore the impact of jealousy on the individual is to corrupt their happiness and destroy their sense of well-being. That then ripples out to the rest of society, partly because if one character is feeling jealous, if their happiness has been lost, then that has an impact on their family. So we see that in terms of the change in relationship between Iago and Desdemona. Also, because Othello is the head of state here in Cyprus, if his mind becomes more chaotic, more confused, more upset because of the jealousy, then that's going to have an impact on how society is organised, because Othello is supposed to be the voice of reason and order, and if he loses that, then society is going to lose its coherence and its stability. So this is a slightly odd title here, Desdemona and Othello discuss hands. So at the start of this little section that we're looking at, Othello returns onto the stage and he says, "Give me your hand. This hand is moist, my lady." And Desdemona says, "It hath yet felt no age, nor known no sorrow." And Othello responds, "This argues fruitfulness and liberal heart, hot, hot and moist." Now, of course, this hand is becoming a euphemism, and a euphemism is where a word or a symbol is substituted for another word which is maybe a bit embarrassing or a bit unspeakable. So, for example, when my cat died a long time ago, it was run over, very sad, and people would say, you know, your cat's gone to a better place. Well, you know, they mean it's kind of gone to heaven. What they mean is the cat's dead and it's buried in a hole in the ground in my garden. But what they say is something that seems much better. It's gone to a better place. It seems much happier. So that's an example of using a euphemism, I suppose, quite positively. What we've got here is Othello saying this hand is moist. So he's using the hand as a symbol of kind of sexual activity. Now, Desdemona doesn't understand this. And she says, well, it's felt no age, nor known no sorrow. You know, there's no particular reason for my hand to be moist. And Othello and Desdemona are therefore at cross purposes. Now, think back to the previous video where Desdemona didn't understand what the clown was saying, and he was using the word lie in different ways and to have different meanings. Desdemona clearly doesn't always follow other people's kind of wordplay and the meanings of what they're actually saying, and that of course shows her innocence and her lack of understanding of the world around her. For Othello here, the fact that he's using a euphemism and that he's talking about sexual activity in public, I suppose, and using a not very pleasant discussion about her hand, shows his increasing level of debasement and how Iago is dragging him down into this very debased way of looking at the world. So then Othello goes on to say, "This hand of yours requires a sequester from liberty." So this hand, or meaning her whole body, her sexual being, requires a sequester. It requires to be hidden away, locked away from liberty. So what Othello's saying is that you've had too much freedom and I need to hide you away now. You need fasting and prayer, castigation, exercise, devout. So what he's suggesting here is that she spends time working on the religious side of her life, so spending time in prayer. I suppose we're thinking a little bit here about, you know, there's a famous line of Shakespeare, "Get thee to a nunnery." So making Desdemona, instead of this kind of beautiful woman who is a major part of society, that she's going to become some kind of religious follower, and she's going to hide herself away, almost as if she was in a nunnery or in a religious order. And Othello then talks about her hand again, and he says, for here's a young and sweating devil here that commonly rebels. So he says that her hand is young. Now remember that Othello is really self-conscious about how much older he is than Desdemona, so that's tangible here. He says it's a sweating devil. So again, there's this kind of undertones of discussion about sex here. In terms of calling her hand a devil, remember that part of debasement is talking a lot about hell and being obsessed with hell rather than heaven. He's also accusing Desdemona of being a devil in the sense that he says that she is completely immoral. He says that her hand or her body commonly rebels, so it frequently rebels against marriage. So what he's saying here is that she's had a lot of affairs with other people. So Othello says all of this, and then Desdemona doesn't quite understand, and she says, it was the hand that gave away my heart. You know, I gave you my heart with my hand. You know, if you imagine the marriage ceremony where people hold hands and that kind of thing, that's what she means there. And Othello says, look, it's a liberal hand. So they're completely at cross purposes here. Desdemona, very innocent, lacking understanding, she's very confused. Othello thinking along very sexual lines here. And then Desdemona says, look, I can't talk about this. Come now, your promise. Now, this is absolutely the worst thing that Desdemona could say at this point. The promise is that Othello has promised in Act 3, Scene 3 that he's going to help Cassio. So Othello's got images of Cassio and Desdemona having an affair in his mind, and then Desdemona compounds that by referring to Cassio. So she's playing into Iago's hands here. And if we go to our big question, how does Shakespeare present the impact of jealousy? Well, the impact of jealousy here is that it is absolutely destroying Othello's mind, destroying everything that's good and noble and wholesome in his mind, and therefore it's also destroying the marriage between these two people. And if we think about what that marriage symbolised, that marriage represented a challenge, a really positive challenge to society's racism. And to the gender, to the patriarchy as well. So we have a white woman marrying a black man. We have a young woman marrying an old man. We have a woman of high class marrying a man who doesn't particularly have any class. We have a marriage that's equal between the man and the woman. And so this marriage symbolised kind of social progress, and it gave us so much hope for the world and how society could change and become more equal. And the jealousy that Iago has created is destroying all of that. So the impact of the jealousy isn't just a kind of small thing. You know, this isn't just about one guy and one girl who got married and it didn't work out. This is about how jealousy and immorality and lack of trust can corrupt society and can hold society back from the progress that was so desperately needed in the Renaissance world. And then Othello starts talking about the handkerchief again. And like the hand, the handkerchief for Othello comes to stand in for Desdemona's infidelity. And he says, that handkerchief did an Egyptian to my mother give. She was a charmer and could almost read the thoughts of people. So he starts to give this handkerchief quite a magical, quite an exotic history that we haven't heard before. And he also says that the handkerchief came from his mother and therefore it has great emotional significance for him. And this Egyptian told his mother, while she kept it, 'twould make her amiable and subdue my father entirely to her love. So while Othello's mother had this handkerchief, her husband would be loyal to her. It would subdue, it would help her to control her husband and keep his love, keep his affection. But if she lost it or made a gift of it, my father's eye should hold her loathed, and his spirit should hunt after new fancies. So if Othello's mother had lost the handkerchief, then that would have led to her husband's infidelity. And then Othello's mother, on her deathbed, again a huge emotional significance of this, gives it to Othello and says to him, bids him, when my fate would have me wife, to give it to her. So his mother gives it to Othello and says, give this to your wife because this will help keep your wife loyal to you. And Othello did this, he gave it to Desdemona. And then he says, to lose it or give away was such perdition as nothing else could match. If anyone gives away this handkerchief, it were perdition, it were hell. It would be so bad, nothing else could be as bad as the situation that would follow upon this. Now, Thomas Rymer, as we talked about in a previous video, had said that the handkerchief is really insignificant and innocuous symbol, and it seems unbelievable that so much emotional charge could be put into this particular object. And I suppose this particular speech would support what Thomas Rymer says. You know, Othello says if you lose the handkerchief, it's absolute hell. You know, it's a little bit like if you lost a wedding ring, for example, or an engagement ring, and all of the implications that that would have to see someone who was married then not wearing their wedding ring. And this word perdition really emphasises how disastrous Othello thinks that situation would be. And we remember the earlier quotation, quite an important quotation from an earlier point in the play, where Othello says, perdition catch my soul, but I do love thee. And when I love thee not, chaos has come again. He says, basically, when he loves Othello, or when he loves Desdemona, it's wonderful. When he doesn't love her, it's perdition, it's hell, and it's chaos. So we have this kind of echo from earlier in the play appearing here as well in Act 3, Scene 4. And then he says here, now this is interesting, he says, it is true there's magic in the web of it. So this handkerchief somehow has magical properties to maintain loyalty between a husband and wife. Now remember in Act 1, Scene 3, Othello insisted that he hadn't used witchcraft. I put the quotation here, this is all the witchcraft I have used. I've told Desdemona stories about my life. And he insisted that there was nothing magical or seductive about their relationship. Now at that point in Act 1, Scene 3, Brabantio was accusing Othello of in a very racist way, and he was linking Othello, because of his race, to the idea of witchcraft, deception, and so on. And Othello denied all of that, and it was a wonderful moment where Othello stood up against racism and said, this stereotype doesn't apply to me. Now here, Othello seems to be using that stereotype and saying, actually, yeah, there's something magical, something enchanted about our relationship. And it's just really interesting that Othello starts to adopt the stereotypes that he'd tried to reject in Act 1. And so there's been a lot of debate about whether Shakespeare is ultimately racist in his portrayal of Othello, because we see the transformation of Othello from a very unstereotypical character to this kind of reductive, stereotypical character. You know, so is Shakespeare racist? Is Iago trying to mould Othello into this stereotype? There's a lot of questions that can be unpacked there. So some more questions for you to think about. And these are things that always come into my mind when I'm reading this section of Act 3, Scene 4. So firstly, if the handkerchief had such a significant history, why did Othello not tell Desdemona when he first gave it to her? So why is he only telling her this now? Then, if the handkerchief is so significant a love token, why did Othello dismiss it when Desdemona first used it in Act 3? So Desdemona in Act 3 takes it out of her pocket to bind Othello's head, and Othello says, your napkin is too little, and they drop it and leave the stage. If it was so significant, why didn't Othello said, oh, you better look after that, don't drop that? Or why did he say, oh, that wonderful handkerchief that you just pulled out of your pocket, that reminds me of how much we love each other? So why this major shift between Act 3, Scene 3 and Act 3, Scene 4? And if it wasn't significant then, why has it become so now? And I suppose the next question is, do you believe what Othello's saying in Act 3, Scene 4? Or is he weaving this web to try and capture Desdemona and try to make Desdemona feel guilty about losing the handkerchief? And then, of course, the fourth question we just talked about on the previous slide, in Act 1, Othello denied using witchcraft. Why is he acknowledging it here? And I suppose the answer to all of these is that between the start of the play and even the start of Act 3, Scene 3 and Act 3, Scene 4, Iago's poison has corrupted Othello's mind. So maybe the handkerchief wasn't that significant when they dropped it in Act 3, Scene 3, but because Iago has talked about it, and because he's linked it in with Cassio, and because he has corrupted and played on Othello's mind, it has become significant now. Maybe the story about Othello's mother and the handkerchief is true, but it wasn't that important before, but it's become important now because Iago has said this handkerchief is important. So this all could be an effect of Iago's character and his poison playing on Othello. Now, a lot of critics have written an awful lot of stuff about the handkerchief. There's been a lot of ink spilled about this particular symbol. But I find this extract from a critic called Michael Donker from 2016 quite interesting, and he says that audiences might detect within the handkerchief's composition an inherent ambiguity. So there's lots of different ways that we could interpret this handkerchief. And this ambiguity Iago plays with and exploits to achieve his own ends. On the one hand, this little piece of white cloth is spun from hallowed silk. So it's little, it's unimportant, but it's also hallowed. It's a religious, it's a magical symbol. And it emblematizes both the unblemished quality of the couple's affections and Desdemona's sexual purity. So the handkerchief is often presented as being white. And so this is the unblemished quality. This is the purity of the relationship between Othello and Desdemona. And it links in with the white wedding sheets that they put on the bed in Act 5. On the other hand, the handkerchief, we find out a little bit later, is patterned with pictures of strawberries. So it's spotted with little bits of red. And that implies loss of virginity. So quite often in the past, you would have put the white wedding sheets down, and then the morning after there would have been little spots of blood, which would have shown the husband that the wife was indeed a virgin. So the handkerchief with these little spots of red is about not only the relationship and the loyalty between the two, but also a symbol of the fact that Desdemona has been sexually pure and sexually loyal to her husband. And Donker writes here that this blood represents the beginning of greater sexual experience and the potential dangers of those experiences. It is this second set of association, with the implications of possible promiscuity, which Iago's accusations draw on. So if this handkerchief, which symbolises Desdemona's loyalty in every possible way to Othello, is given to Cassio, then it shows promiscuity. It shows that she's been disloyal to Othello. So even though Thomas Rhymer has said that the handkerchief is insignificant, in Othello's mind it takes on this huge significance and all of these different ideas and symbols. And this is what the impact of jealousy is, I suppose. This is how jealousy works, is that it takes little tiny details and it expands them and makes them much bigger than they actually are. And we know that Othello is maybe not thinking rationally here, but that's kind of the point that Shakespeare's trying to make, that jealousy prevents people from making rational decisions. Okay, so Othello leaves and Desdemona is incredibly upset, and she turns to Amelia and Iago for help. And Amelia maybe doesn't necessarily provide her with a lot of help, but we do find out a lot about Amelia's cynicism about the world here. And Amelia says, "'Tis not a year or two shows us a man." So even if you're married to someone for a couple of years, you don't really know them. "They are all but stomachs, and we are all but food. They eat us hungrily, and when they are full, they belch us." So we get the sense here that Amelia has been used and exploited in her marriage to Iago. And there's a lot of sexual imagery here, of course. Amelia's using a euphemism, just as Othello did earlier on in the scene. And what she says is that women in a patriarchal society are completely at the mercy of men. They're used and abused by men, and then they're cast off. And this kind of motif of sexual appetite is repeated throughout the play as well. It's interesting that she uses the pronouns they and we to show a complete separation of men and women. At the start of Act 2, Scene 1, we had this possibility that Othello and Desdemona could have an equal marriage, that they could, talk to each other and be on an equal footing. But here, Amelia's pronouns suggest that that wouldn't be possible at all. And then Amelia says that jealous souls will not be answered, so they're not ever jealous for the cause, but jealous for their jealous. So Amelia is saying it doesn't take much of a reason to cause jealousy. But jealousy just breeds. It is a monster begot upon itself, born upon itself. So she's using this monstrous imagery that we've talked about before and conjuring up a lot of ideas about how jealousy is uncontrollable, how you can't stop it once it's been unleashed. And it is begot upon itself, so it kind of conceives itself, or it gives birth to itself almost. So as soon as that seed is implanted in somebody's mind, it grows and grows and grows. And of course we know that Iago is jealous of Amelia and the possible relationship she might have had with other people. He accuses Amelia of having an affair with Othello at one point, and Iago's also worried that she's going to have an affair with Cassio. So we know that Amelia is speaking out of her real experience of her marriage to Iago and how awful that is, and she's trying to warn Desdemona what can happen. And I suppose this is one of the points in a tragedy where you think, you know what, maybe the end is not inevitable. You know, maybe if Desdemona listens to Amelia and understands what Amelia is saying, she can do something with this greater understanding of the human condition. She can take that understanding and she can do something that's going to change the course of the play. But then, of course, that doesn't happen. Sorry for the spoiler there. Okay, a bit of independent learning for you then. So I want you to think about the different possible symbolisms of the handkerchief or its function in the play, and then come up with a quotation and an explanation to match that. And I've put an example on the screen there. Okay, in the next video, we're going to look at the final section of Act 3, Scene 4. So thanks for listening and see you next time.